The black girl helped a forgotten Apache boy. 15 years later, he returned with an army of warriors. "You owe $800, girl, and I'm here to collect." The silver-haired land baron sneers, waving forged papers before the trembling washerwoman. The crowded saloon erupts in cruel laughter as townsfolk dismiss her as just another colored servant destined for the streets. They assume she'll be begging for scraps by week's end, another victim of the territory's corrupt land grabs. But the weathered preacher in the corner recognizes something familiar in her defiant eyes. The same fire he once saw in displaced tribes during his cavalry days. Hidden beneath this fraudulent debt lies a childhood secret that could destroy her. 15 years ago, she saved a dying Apache boy, an act of treason that her enemies now know about. Will this forgotten mercy become her salvation? Or will the ghosts of compassion past drag her into a grave alongside the boy she once rescued? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The silver-haired land baron slammed the forged papers onto the rickety table with enough force to rattle Chloe Reynolds' teacup. The crowded hotel lobby fell silent as every eye turned toward the young black woman who spent her days scrubbing their floors and washing their sheets. $800, Elijah Crawford announced, his voice carrying across the room like a death sentence. Your daddy's debt comes due today, girl." Chloe's hands trembled as she stared at the documents. The ink looked fresh, the signature nothing like her father's careful script. But in Mesa Ridge, Arizona territory, the word of a wealthy white man carried more weight than truth itself. "I don't understand, Mr. Crawford. Papa never borrowed money from you." Crawford's thin lips curved into a predatory smile. "Court says otherwise. You got 3 days to pay up or forfeit the land." The hotel guests whispered among themselves, their voices mixing pity with cruel satisfaction. Another colored family about to lose everything. Another example of why some folks weren't meant to own property in civilized territory. Chloe felt the familiar weight of invisibility pressing down on her shoulders. To these people, she was nothing more than a servant girl destined for the streets. Her 23 years of hard work, of caring for her dying mother, of maintaining the small plot of land her father had legitimately purchased after the war, meant nothing. The weathered man in preacher's clothes sitting near the window caught her attention. Unlike the others, Nathaniel Evers wasn't watching with amusement. His steel-gray eyes held something different. Recognition, maybe, or remembrance of his own losses. Crawford gathered his papers with theatrical flourish. 3 days, girl. Then Sheriff Morrison and I will be back to collect what's owed." The crowd dispersed as Crawford swept from the hotel, leaving Chloe alone with her racing thoughts and the preacher's steady gaze. She hurried back to the tiny cabin behind the hotel where her mother lay dying of consumption. Sarah Reynolds barely lifted her head from the pillow when Chloe entered. Her once strong mother had withered to skin and bones, each breath a struggle that tore at Chloe's heart. "Mama, we got trouble." Sarah's eyes sharpened despite her weakness. "Crawford?" "He's got papers saying Papa owed him money, $800. Sarah struggled to sit up, her skeletal hands gripping the quilt. "That's impossible. Your father never borrowed from that snake." "I know, Mama, but the law don't care what we know." Sarah stared at the cabin's far wall for a long moment. Then, with effort that seemed to drain her remaining strength, she pointed toward the loose floorboard near the stove.
"Pull that up!" Chloe knelt and pried at the warped wood until it came free. Beneath lay a leather satchel she'd never seen before. Her mother's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Your father wasn't just a freed slave, child. He was educated. Been working with folks back east. Writing letters, making connections. Inside the satchel, Chloe found documents that made her head spin. Legal papers proving their legitimate ownership of the land. Letters from abolitionists in Boston and New York. Correspondence with territorial officials about land rights and fair treatment. But the most shocking discovery came in a bundle tied with red ribbon. Letters addressed to tribal leaders throughout the territory. Her father had been serving as a secret liaison between freed slaves and displaced native tribes, helping both groups navigate the corrupt legal system that preyed on the powerless. "There's more," Sarah wheezed, behind the loose stone in the fireplace. Chloe found a small wooden box containing $20 gold pieces, more money than she'd ever seen. Enough to pay Crawford's fraudulent debt twice over. But more important than the money was the list of names tucked beneath the coins. Contacts throughout the territory who shared her father's vision of justice. "He was building something bigger than just our little plot of land," Sarah continued. "A network of folks fighting back against men like Crawford. Now it's yours." The revelation hit Chloe like a physical blow. She wasn't just a powerless washerwoman facing eviction. She was the inheritor of a resistance movement her father had spent years building. "How many families has Crawford stolen from?" she asked. 16 that we know of. Always the same method. Forged debts, corrupt officials, families too scared or poor to fight back. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Nathaniel Evers stood in the doorway, his preacher's collar slightly askew. "Forgive the intrusion, miss. I couldn't help overhearing your trouble with Crawford." Sarah studied the man with eyes that had seen too much betrayal. "You're new in town, preacher." "Yes, ma'am. Name's Nathaniel Evers. Used to be cavalry before I found the calling." Chloe noticed how his hands bore calluses from more than just Bible reading. "Why do you care about our troubles?" "Because I've seen Crawford's work before, in other towns, other territories. He's got a system, and good folks suffer for it." Sarah's breathing grew more labored. "Chloe, show him the papers." As Chloe spread the documents across the table, she caught something in Evers' expression. Not surprise, but confirmation of suspicions he'd already harbored. "Your father was smart," Evers said quietly, "building bridges between communities instead of walls. But Crawford knows about this, doesn't he?" "What do you mean?" "A man like Crawford doesn't randomly target a family unless he's got leverage." "What aren't you telling me?" Chloe's blood turned cold as childhood memories surfaced. 15 years ago, she'd found a beaten Apache boy hiding in the woods, fed him, tended his wounds, helped him escape before the bounty hunters found him. In this territory, that act of mercy could be called treason. If Crawford knew about the boy, her father's resistance network meant nothing. The corrupt system would paint her as an Indian sympathizer and justify taking everything. The next morning brought news that confirmed Chloe's worst fears. Dr. Malcolm Hayes appeared at her cabin door, his usually steady hands shaking as he clutched his medical bag. "I need to speak with you privately," he whispered, glancing nervously toward the hotel. Nathaniel Evers emerged from behind the cabin where he'd been chopping firewood. The preacher had spent the night keeping watch, claiming traveling men learned to sleep with one eye open. "Dr. Hayes, isn't it?" Evers said, his tone carefully neutral. Hayes nodded tersely. "Preacher, Miss Reynolds. What I'm about to tell you could get us both killed." Chloe felt her stomach drop. "Crawford knows about the boy." "How did you?" Hayes stopped himself. "Yes, he knows about the Apache child you helped 15 years ago. My son Tommy told him.
The boy needed money for his gambling debts. The betrayal cut deep. Tommy Hayes had been one of the few white children who'd shown Chloe kindness growing up. Now his weakness had put her life in danger. Crawford's planning something bigger than just taking your land, Hayes continued. He's been systematically targeting families with any connection to tribal sympathies. 16 families so far, all with the same forged debt scheme. Evers stepped closer. What makes you so certain about the number? Hayes pulled a small notebook from his coat. Because I've been documenting every family he's destroyed. Every forged signature I've been forced to validate as town physician. Every lie I've told to keep my own family safe. Chloe studied the doctor's haggard face. Why are you helping us now? Because Crawford's gotten greedy. He's demanding I declare more families mentally incompetent so he can seize their land faster. I can't keep living with what I've helped him do. The notebook contained meticulous records of Crawford's crimes. Names, dates, forged amounts, and detailed descriptions of how each family had been driven from their homes. Hayes had been keeping evidence while participating in the corruption, a man torn between survival and conscience. There's more, Hayes said. Crawford has been buying up territorial officials, judges, clerks, even some federal representatives. He's building an empire on stolen land. Evers examined the notebook with the sharp eye of a former military officer. This documentation could bring down his entire operation. But we need more than one man's testimony. The town clerk has been keeping his own records, Hayes admitted. Marcus Webb is terrified, but he's been documenting every transaction. Crawford doesn't know about Webb's private journal. Chloe felt a spark of hope. Her father's network had prepared her for exactly this kind of fight. She knew how to contact the displaced families, how to organize resistance, how to build cases against corrupt officials. Over the next 2 days, she and Evers worked systematically through her father's list of contacts. One by one, families came forward with their stories. The Hendersons had lost their cattle ranch to a forged $800 debt. The Morales family had been driven from their homestead over a fictitious loan for farm equipment. The Washingtons, another freed slave family, had forfeited their land to avoid imprisonment on charges of theft they never committed. Each story followed the same pattern. Crawford would identify vulnerable families, manufacture fraudulent debts, then use his network of corrupt officials to enforce the seizures. Families who resisted faced trumped-up criminal charges or mysterious accidents. But something else was happening in Mesa Ridge. Strange occurrences that the townspeople attributed to increased Apache activity in the surrounding hills. Supplies appeared overnight at the homes of Crawford's previous victims. Sacks of flour, blankets, occasionally even gold coins left where struggling families would find them. Crawford's hired thugs reported their horses going lame or their weapons malfunctioning at crucial moments. Several men claimed to have seen Apache scouts watching them from distant ridges. Chloe began to notice the pattern. Every family that received mysterious aid had been kind to native peoples in the past, small gestures of humanity that most folks had forgotten. But someone was remembering. The revelation came when Marcus Webb finally agreed to meet them at the abandoned church outside town. The nervous clerk carried a leather-bound journal that contained detailed records of every fraudulent transaction Crawford had forced him to process. "I've been documenting everything for 3 years," Webb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every forged signature, every bribed official, every family destroyed. I kept thinking someone from the territorial government would investigate, but Crawford owns them all." As Webb opened his journal, Evers noticed something that made him stiffen. "Those Apache scouts the townspeople have been reporting. Have you seen them yourself?" "Once," Webb nodded. 3 men on horseback, watching from Eagle Ridge. But they weren't hostile, just observing. Chloe felt a strange certainty settling in her chest. The mysterious protection, the targeted aid to families who'd shown kindness to native peoples, the careful observation of Crawford's activities. Someone was building a case against the corruption, just as her father had taught her to do. "We need to accelerate our timeline," she told Evers. "Crawford's getting suspicious about all the families suddenly willing to testify." That night, as they prepared their evidence for presentation to honest territorial officials, Chloe found herself remembering the Apache boy's face. His dark eyes had held intelligence and determination even as a child. If he had survived, if he had grown to manhood, what kind of leader might he have become? The question would be answered sooner than she expected. The morning of the third day arrived with an unusual stillness that made the horses restless and the dogs whine. Chloe stood at her cabin window, watching the eastern hills where dust clouds had been visible since dawn. Not the random movement of wild animals, but the organized advance of many riders moving with military precision. Crawford arrived at the hotel early, flanked by Sheriff Morrison and 3 hired men. He carried official-looking papers and wore the confident smile of a man who believed he held all the advantages. The hotel lobby filled with curious townspeople, eager to witness another family's destruction. Chloe emerged from her cabin carrying her father's leather satchel. Nathaniel Evers walked beside her, his preacher's demeanor masking the alertness of a former cavalry officer. Dr. Hayes lingered near the hotel entrance, his nervous energy betraying the weight of his coming confession. "Right on time," Crawford announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I do appreciate punctuality in business matters." Before Chloe could respond, the thunder of approaching horses drew every eye toward the main street. A delegation of riders appeared, their formation too precise for a raiding party, too formal for casual travelers. The lead rider wore traditional Apache clothing, mixed with the tailored vest of an educated man. The townspeople pressed backward as the riders entered the town square. These weren't the desperate raiders they'd expected, but dignified representatives of multiple tribes. Navajo, Apache, and Hopi men rode together in a display of unity that no one in Mesa Ridge had ever witnessed. The lead rider dismounted with fluid grace, his movements carrying the authority of natural leadership. He stood tall and straight, his dark eyes taking in the scene with intelligent assessment. When his gaze found Chloe, recognition passed between them like lightning. "Chief Kona of the Navajo," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Son of Chief Manuelito, educated at the Carlisle School, trained in territorial law." Crawford's confident smile faltered. This wasn't the scenario he'd prepared for. "This is a private business matter, Chief. No concern of yours." Kona stepped forward, his bearing commanding respect from even the most prejudiced observers. Miss Reynolds' concerns became tribal concerns 15 years ago when she saved the life of a dying Apache boy. The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Chloe felt tears spring to her eyes as childhood memories flooded back. The broken, beaten child she'd found in the woods had grown into this impressive leader. Her act of mercy had survived and flourished beyond anything she could have imagined. "I was that boy," Kona continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "Beaten by bounty hunters and left to die. Miss Reynolds found me, fed me, tended my wounds, and helped me reach safety. Her compassion saved my life and changed the course of tribal history." Crawford's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the legal debt. $800, documented and witnessed." Kona smiled, the expression holding no warmth for the land baron. "We've spent considerable time investigating your legal documents, Mr. Crawford. Our coalition includes 3 men trained in territorial law and 2 former territorial clerks who recognize forgery when they see it." One of the other riders dismounted, carrying a saddlebag filled with papers. The documents he spread across a nearby table made Crawford take an involuntary step backward. Official territorial seals, signed statements, and what appeared to be extensive legal briefs. 16 families, Kona announced, all victims of the same fraudulent debt scheme. We have documentation of every forged signature, every bribed official, every illegal seizure you've orchestrated across 3 counties. Chloe stared in amazement at the scope of evidence Kona had assembled. This wasn't just about her family's land anymore. The Apache boy she'd saved had spent 15 years building a case that could bring down an entire network of territorial corruption. Furthermore, Kona continued, we have testimony from tribal members who witnessed your hired men destroying survey markers and altering boundary stones to expand your illegal claims onto tribal lands. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his hands shaking as he pulled out his notebook. I can corroborate those statements. I've been documenting Mr. Crawford's crimes for 3 years. The crowd's mood shifted perceptibly as the scope of Crawford's deception became clear. These weren't just attacks on individual families, but systematic theft that had destabilized the entire region. Sheriff Morrison, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. Chief, those are serious accusations. You got proof to back them up? Kona nodded to another member of his delegation, who produced a leather portfolio thick with documents. Sworn statements from 43 witnesses, territorial survey records showing systematic boundary alterations, and this. He held up a journal bound in distinctive red leather. Marcus Webb's complete records of every fraudulent transaction processed through the territorial clerk's office. 3 years of evidence that implicates not just Crawford, but judges and officials across the territory. Crawford's hired men shifted nervously, suddenly outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The land baron himself looked around desperately for support that no longer existed. You've made one critical error, Mr. Crawford, Kona said quietly. You assumed that displaced peoples have no power, no education, no ability to organize effective resistance. You underestimated what 15 years of gratitude and determination could accomplish. Chloe found her voice at last. The army you brought isn't just warriors, is it? Kona's stern expression softened when he looked at her. Lawyers, translators, tribal historians, and yes, warriors if needed. But we prefer justice to violence. You taught me that compassion creates stronger solutions than force. Crawford made one final desperate play. Sheriff Morrison, these people are trying to intimidate legal proceedings. I demand protection. Morrison looked at the mountain of evidence, then at Crawford's sweating face. Seems to me the intimidation's been going the other direction for quite some time. Crawford's desperation became dangerous as the weight of evidence mounted against him. Rather than accept defeat, he retreated to the hotel with his remaining supporters, plotting a final gambit that would either secure his empire or destroy everyone who threatened it. This isn't over, he told his hired men as they huddled in the hotel's back room. We frame this as an Indian uprising. Tell everyone these tribal coalitions are threatening white settlers. Fear will bring the townspeople back to our side. His plan was simple and vicious. Paint Kona's peaceful delegation as a war party, claim Chloe was coordinating attacks on innocent families, and use territorial prejudices to justify extreme measures. If legal corruption couldn't save him, racial hatred might. Crawford's first move was sending riders to neighboring settlements with fabricated reports of Apache raids. His second was bribing the territorial telegraph operator to send alarming messages about imminent tribal warfare. By evening, armed settlers from 3 counties were riding toward Mesa Ridge, convinced they were saving white civilization from savage attack. Kona recognized the danger immediately. His scouts reported the approaching riders, their hostile intentions clear from their formation and weaponry. The careful legal strategy he'd planned could be destroyed by mob violence before truth had a chance to prevail. We need to separate fact from fear, he told Chloe as they gathered in the abandoned church where Marcus Webb had first shared his evidence. Crawford is counting on prejudice to override justice. Nathaniel Evers studied the tactical situation with his military experience. He's got maybe 60 armed men coming from the surrounding settlements. They'll arrive by tomorrow afternoon, already convinced you're leading a war party. Dr. Hayes wrung his hands nervously. The townspeople are starting to waver. Crawford's been spreading rumors that the tribal coalition plans to burn out all white settlers. Some folks are talking about fleeing before the violence starts. Chloe felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her childhood act of kindness had grown into something that could reshape the entire territory. But only if they could prevent Crawford from turning fear into bloodshed. "We need to divide his strategy," she said, thinking like her father had taught her. "Separate the legal case from the racial panic. Show people that this isn't about tribal warfare, but about stopping corruption that hurts everyone." Kona nodded approvingly. "Your father taught you well. But how do we overcome 15 years of territorial prejudice in less than 24 hours? The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus Webb arrived at the church carrying news that changed everything. Sheriff Morrison had been conducting his own quiet investigation for months, gathering evidence against Crawford's network while pretending to support it. "Morrison's been playing both sides," Webb explained breathlessly. "He's been documenting Crawford's bribes, recording conversations, building a case for the territorial authorities. But he needed more evidence before he could act." Morrison himself appeared in the church doorway, his badge reflecting the lamplight. "I've been waiting 3 years for enough proof to bring down Crawford's entire operation. Your tribal coalition just gave me what I needed." The sheriff spread his own collection of documents across the Alton. Detailed records of bribes paid and received, transcripts of conversations where Crawford admitted to fraud, and correspondence with corrupt territorial officials that implicated a network spanning 5 counties. "Crawford doesn't know I've been gathering this evidence," Morrison continued. "He thinks I'm just another bought lawman. But my brother lost his ranch to one of these fraudulent debt schemes 2 years ago. This became personal." The revelation transformed their strategic situation. With Morrison's cooperation, they could present a united front of law enforcement, tribal leadership, and territorial documentation that would be difficult for even prejudiced settlers to dismiss. But Crawford wasn't finished. His final desperate move came at sunset when he gathered the townspeople in the hotel lobby for what he called an emergency meeting about the Indian threat. "They've come with an army," he declared, his voice carrying the practiced authority that had intimidated so many families. "Dozens of warriors surrounding our town, planning attacks on innocent settlers. We need to act before they strike." Several townspeople shifted nervously, their fears overriding their judgment. The sight of Kona's disciplined delegation had been impressive, but Crawford was framing it as evidence of hostile intent. "That colored girl has been working with them for years," Crawford continued, building toward his climax. 15 years ago, she helped an Apache boy escape justice. Now he's returned to repay that debt with our blood." The crowd's murmur grew uglier as Crawford's words took effect. Fear and prejudice were simpler than complex questions of legal corruption and territorial justice. But Kona had anticipated this reaction. His next move demonstrated the strategic thinking that had built his unprecedented tribal coalition. Rather than respond with anger or defensive explanations, he sent a delegation to meet with the approaching settlers before they reached Mesa Ridge. The delegation included 3 men, educated at Eastern schools, 2 former territorial clerks who could explain the legal evidence, and most importantly, several white settlers whose land Crawford had stolen. Victims who could testify that the tribal coalition wasn't threatening white families, but trying to protect all families from systematic fraud. As night fell over Mesa Ridge, two competing narratives fought for control of the truth. Crawford's story of racial conflict and tribal uprising versus Kona and Chloe's evidence of legal corruption and organized theft. The resolution would come with dawn, when the approaching settlers would have to choose between fear and justice. Dawn brought a crowd of over 200 people to Mesa Ridge's town square. The approaching settlers had arrived during the night, but Kona's advance delegation had done their work well. Instead of armed hostility, the newcomers brought questions and demands for answers. Crawford stood on the hotel's front steps, flanked by his remaining supporters and hired men. His confident demeanor from the previous day had cracked, replaced by the desperate energy of a cornered animal. The sight of so many settlers listening to tribal representatives rather than rallying to his cause had shattered his final strategy. Chloe positioned herself near the center of the square, her father's leather satchel containing the original evidence that had started their investigation. Nathaniel Evers stood beside her, his preacher's collar serving as a symbol of moral authority that even the most prejudiced settlers respected. Kona arranged his coalition in a formation that demonstrated discipline rather than aggression. His warriors remained mounted but relaxed, their weapons visible but not threatening. The lawyers and translators stood ready with their documented evidence, while the white settler victims of Crawford's fraud positioned themselves where their former neighbors could see them. Sheriff Morrison took control of the proceedings with the authority of genuine law enforcement, rather than Crawford's purchased influence. We're here to present evidence of territorial crimes that affect every family in 5 counties. Everyone deserves to hear the truth. The systematic presentation began with Marcus Webb's journal. The nervous clerk's voice shook as he read entry after entry, documenting fraudulent transactions. But his detailed records painted an undeniable pattern of organized theft. Dr. Hayes followed with his confession, his medical reputation lending weight to his testimony about the systematic coercion he'd witnessed and participated in. Several townspeople gasped as he described how Crawford had forced him to declare mentally competent families insane to justify land seizures. But the most powerful testimony came from the white families Crawford had destroyed. The Hendersons described losing their cattle ranch to a forged debt they never owed. The Morales family explained how Crawford's men had burned their crops and poisoned their well after the fraudulent foreclosure. Each story followed the identical pattern of manufactured debts and corrupt enforcement. Crawford attempted to interrupt several times, but Sheriff Morrison's presence and the mounting evidence silenced his objections. The crowd's mood shifted as the scope of his crimes became undeniable. These weren't isolated incidents, but systematic attacks on any family vulnerable enough to target. Kona's presentation of the tribal coalition's evidence transformed the entire narrative. Rather than savage warriors threatening civilization, his delegation revealed itself as a sophisticated legal organization that had spent years documenting territorial corruption. We began investigating land theft 3 years ago when Crawford's operations expanded onto tribal territories, Kona explained to the hushed crowd. Our research revealed that his fraud network had destroyed 47 families across 5 counties, both white and native. The coalition's documentation was overwhelming. Survey records showing systematic boundary alterations, correspondence with corrupt territorial officials, and witness statements from tribal members who had observed Crawford's men destroying legitimate property markers and replacing them with fraudulent ones. But Kona's most devastating evidence came in the form of Crawford's own correspondence, obtained through the testimony of a former clerk who had kept copies of sensitive documents before fleeing the territory in fear. These letters show Crawford's own words describing his victims as easy targets. Kona read from the documents. Families too poor to fight back, too isolated to find help, too different to gain community sympathy. The crowd's anger began redirecting itself toward its proper target as Crawford's calculating cruelty became clear. He hadn't been protecting white settlers from tribal threats, but preying on anyone vulnerable enough to victimize. Sheriff Morrison's revelation provided the final blow to Crawford's credibility. I've been building a case against this fraud network for 2 years, documenting every bribe, recording every threat, gathering evidence for territorial prosecutors. Morrison's badge and official status carried weight that even the most prejudiced settlers couldn't dismiss. His detailed records of Crawford's criminal network implicated judges, clerks, and officials across multiple counties in a conspiracy that had stolen thousands of acres and destroyed dozens of families. Crawford made his final, desperate play as the evidence mounted against him. "You're all fools if you trust these people over your own kind. This is exactly what they want, turning white folks against each other while they take our land." But his words fell flat against the mountain of evidence and the testimony of his white victims. The Henderson family's lost ranch, the Morales family's burned crops, the Washington family's fraudulent imprisonment. All Crawford's handiwork, with no tribal involvement whatsoever. Dr. Hayes stepped forward with the courage that had been building throughout the confrontation. "Crawford threatened my family if I didn't cooperate with his schemes. He's been blackmailing town officials for years, using our fears and debts to force participation in his crimes." The revelation broke the last resistance among Crawford's supporters. If the respected town physician had been coerced into cooperation, how many others had been trapped by similar threats? Kona made the final statement that sealed Crawford's fate. "Miss Reynolds saved my life 15 years ago through simple human kindness. Today, we repay that debt by bringing justice to all families Crawford has destroyed, regardless of race or origin." Crawford's hired men began backing away as the crowd's hostility focused entirely on their employer. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward with territorial arrest warrants that had been prepared during the night's legal proceedings. The systematic destruction of Crawford's criminal empire was complete. The arrest of Elijah Crawford marked the beginning of the largest territorial corruption investigation in Arizona's history. Sheriff Morrison's handcuffs closed around Crawford's wrists as federal marshals arrived to take custody of the evidence that would reshape territorial law enforcement. Dr. Hayes stepped forward voluntarily, his medical bag in one hand and his confession in the other. "I'll testify against every official who participated in this conspiracy. It's time to heal the damage we've done." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the man who had controlled their community through fear and fraud was led away in chains. The settlers who had ridden to Mesa Ridge, expecting to fight tribal raiders, found themselves witnessing justice instead of warfare. Kona's coalition began the systematic work of returning stolen land to its rightful owners. The tribal lawyers had prepared restitution documents for every fraudulent seizure, while the white settler victims provided testimony that supported each family's legitimate claims. Chloe stood in the town square, surrounded by people who had dismissed her as powerless just days earlier. The transformation was complete. She had evolved from invisible washerwoman to community leader, carrying forward her father's vision of justice across racial lines. The Henderson family reclaimed their cattle ranch with tears of gratitude, and 3 years of stolen profits returned from Crawford's seized assets. The Morales family received not only their homestead back, but compensation for their destroyed crops and poisoned well. Each restoration followed the same pattern of documented justice replacing systematic theft. But the changes extended far beyond individual land returns. Kona's unprecedented tribal coalition had established a permanent legal alliance with territorial authorities, creating the first formal framework for cooperative law enforcement between Native peoples and territorial government. Nathaniel Evers found the redemption that had eluded him since his cavalry days. Instead of enforcing displacement, he was helping restore families to their rightful homes. His military skills served justice rather than conquest, for the first time in decades. The investigation expanded rapidly as Crawford's network collapsed under federal scrutiny. Corrupt judges faced impeachment proceedings. Crooked clerks fled the territory ahead of arrest warrants. Bribed officials found themselves stripped of authority and facing criminal charges. Mesa Ridge transformed from a community ruled by fear into a model of cooperative justice. The hotel lobby where Crawford had announced his fraudulent claims became a meeting place where white settlers and tribal representatives worked together on legal reforms. Marcus Webb emerged from his nervous shell to become the territory's most effective corruption investigator. His detailed documentation skills, honed through years of secret record-keeping, proved invaluable in building cases against the extensive criminal network. Dr. Hayes dedicated his remaining years to genuine healing, using his medical knowledge to serve all community members, regardless of race or background. His rehabilitation became a symbol of how corrupt individuals could choose redemption over continued criminality. The 16 families Crawford had destroyed found their voices and their power. United by shared victimization, they formed a mutual aid society that helped future families resist fraud and corruption. Their alliance crossed racial lines that territorial prejudice had previously made impermeable. Chloe's cabin became an unofficial headquarters for territorial justice reform. Her father's hidden network evolved into an open organization dedicated to protecting vulnerable families from exploitation. The resistance movement he had built in secret now operated in daylight, with legal authority backing its mission. Kona established the first intertribal legal clinic in territorial history, staffed by native lawyers educated in both traditional justice systems and territorial law. The clinic provided free legal services to any family threatened by fraud or corruption, regardless of their background. The partnership between Chloe and Kona extended beyond their personal connection to create lasting institutional change. Their childhood bond, forged through simple human kindness, had grown into a legal framework that protected thousands of families across the Southwest. 6 months after Crawford's arrest, Territorial Governor Conrad formally recognized the tribal coalition as an official law enforcement partner. The ceremony took place in Mesa Ridge's town square, where fear had once ruled through fraudulent documents and corrupt authority. Chloe stood beside Kona as the governor signed the historic agreement, thinking about the scared Apache boy she had found in the woods 15 years earlier. That act of mercy had rippled through time to reshape an entire region's approach to justice and cooperation. The final symbol of transformation came when Chloe and Kona planted a young oak tree on her family's land, its roots extending into soil that had been fought over, stolen, and finally restored to its rightful owners. The tree represented growth from the seeds of childhood compassion into a forest of institutional justice. Mesa Ridge's success attracted attention throughout the territory. Other communities began requesting help in identifying and prosecuting their own corruption networks. The model of cooperative law enforcement spread across Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado territories. Nathaniel Evers established a traveling ministry that combined religious services with legal education, teaching vulnerable families how to recognize and resist fraud. His sermons emphasized justice and protection rather than conquest and displacement. The courthouse that had once rubber-stamped Crawford's fraudulent claims became a beacon of legitimate legal proceedings. Every family that had lost land to corruption received full restitution, while the systematic reforms prevented future fraud networks from taking root. Chloe often walked to the hilltop overlooking Mesa Ridge, watching the community that had grown from the ashes of corruption into something her father could never have imagined. #@Meta. Pause. Hubby. Sex, 0.05. His vision of justice across racial lines had become reality through the simple act of childhood kindness that connected her forever to Kona. The forgotten Apache boy had indeed returned with an army, but it was an army of lawyers, witnesses, and documented truth that conquered through justice rather than warfare.